This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 26 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, June 25th, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with a section called Deaths. Edwin E. Haywood died at his home in Arlington Heights, June 17. Death was due to a fall from his wagon while riding on his market garden farm on a load of boxes. Mr. Haywood was a native of Westford and had lived here nearly all his life, owning the farm on the Chamberlain Road about 4¼ miles south of the old Chamberlain blacksmith shop. About 6 years ago, he sold his farm and moved to Arlington. When the old Stony Brook School was in its palmy days and crowded with usefulness and scholars, he was one of the large and bright scholars. He was always genial, jolly, and unruffled. From school to citizen, he preserved the same quiet, calm attitude towards public questions. This is undoubtedly written by Samuel L. Taylor, who was probably a schoolmate of Edwin Haywood's at the Stony Brook School. The funeral took place from the Unitarian Church, Westford, on Monday afternoon. This was the church of his father and his own early mature deliberation. Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey, who conducted the service, was, as usual, wisely choice in thought. Edson G. Boynton and Mrs. Homer M. Seavey paid tribute to the occasion with 2 appropriate songs. Mr. Haywood was 75 years old and leaves a widow and 2 daughters. Several years ago, his family of 4 daughters was divided by death. Burial was in Fairview Cemetery by the side of his kindred dust. David A. Grieg had charge of the burial. The bearers were John McMaster, Houghton G. Osgood, old-time neighbors, and the 2 sons-in-law. The funeral of Maria Martha Gilson took place from the West Chelmsford Church on Thursday afternoon of last week and was largely attended. Reverend Mr. Matthews of Lowell conducted the services. The bearers were Walter A. Whitten, Elmer Whitten, Leonard Whitten, and J.N. Fletcher. Burial was in the village cemetery in charge of David A. Grieg. Mrs. Gilson was born in Westford. The paper says in 1834, but she was actually born February 1st, 1835, the daughter of Joshua and Mary Martha Fletcher Whitten of the old Whitten family on Oak Hill Road. For 40 years, they lived on Forest Hill in Dunstable and was close neighbor of the late Henry J. Tolles, Tolles. A few years ago, she returned to her old home, now occupied by her nephew, Walter A. Whitten, where she died. She leaves 1 son, Elmer Gilson of Pepperell, 2 brothers, George W. Whitten of North Chelmsford and Augustus F. Whitten of Whitten's Corner, Westford. She was of rugged New England build in character and constitution and was a niece of Levi T. Fletcher of Brookside. Whitten's Corner is the intersection of Groton Road and Oak Hill Road. It was in that area that many of these Whittens lived. The next section is the About Town section. Miss Clara Wright is expected soon from Cleveland at her summer home on Groton Road at Brookside. The essentials of summer have already arrived by express. She will spend the summer with her aunt, Miss Sarah Richardson, who observed her 92nd birthday on June 15th. She is the well-preserved type of the New England life from original design. John A. Taylor is homeward bound from Maine University for the summer vacation, touring at Atlantic City and Washington as part of the home procedure. He has accepted a position at the University of North Dakota. The Unitarian Society observed last Sunday as Flower Sunday. The church was tastefully decorated with banks and baskets of beautiful mountain laurel sent from Milford, New Hampshire by Frank E. Wilkins to friends here. So generous was the donation and so lovely the coloring that nothing more appropriate could have been chosen for a June Sunday decoration. Charles E. Walker has sweet corn over 2 feet high. The rest of us had no need now to try. Faith without, this is a quote, faith without works is dead, end quote. It's a quote from the book of James, chapter 2, verses 20 and 26, has always been on the guide board at the old First Parish Church, and the Sunday school exemplified it by a gift of $12 towards a scholarship at Tuskegee, as per Reverend Chisholm's recent plea. Outside of the Sunday school, it is expected that members of the parish will add some of, quote, faith by works, end quote. The old First Parish Church was well represented at the conference at Tingsboro last week, Thursday. In the absence of Abiel J. Abbott as president of the conference, Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey was unanimously chosen to preside with his usual aptitude for kindling the fire of the Spirit and plenty of reserve to keep it well fanned. At a meeting of the Cavalry Association at the Cavalry Building, it was voted to hold the annual reunion at Westford Center on Thursday, August 11th. The new playground will be ready for this reunion, and this will be an appropriate time to decorate it with the friendship of Troop F. The new playground is Whitney's playground that was mentioned in last week's podcast. The next section is Westford Center, spelled C-E-N-T-R-E. Among the teachers at home for the summer vacation are Miss Jenny Ferguson from Presque Isle, Maine, Miss Edna Ferguson from Beverly, Miss Ruth Tuttle from New Bedford, Miss Edith A. Wright from Ayer, Miss Edith Bicknell from Royalston, and Mrs. Jenny Chandler, Lila Fisher and Julia Hall from Boston. The teachers at the Frost School have returned to their several homes, Miss Grant to Gloucester, Miss Burnham to Essex, and Miss Cushing to Southborough. Miss Cushing does not intend to return in the fall, having resigned. She has taught here for the last 4 years, first in the old Center Primary and later in the new school building, that is, the Frost School. She has made a record for herself as a faithful and conscientious teacher and has entered into the social and church life of the village most helpfully, and she will be much missed by her friends. Miss Augustus Layton and Minnie Pollard have been guests this week at Mrs. Mary E. Fletcher's. Edwin A. Hamlin of this village and Miss Annie Oldham of Forge Village were married in Lowell June 18th by Reverend Caleb E. Fisher. They have set up housekeeping in part of the old Hamlin homestead. That's the house at the end of Hildreth Street at Boston Road at 2 Hildreth Street. And Mrs. Abby Hamlin occupies the rest of the house. Charles O. Prescott was a weekend guest of John P. Wright's at their summer home in North Plymouth this last week. Mr. and Mrs. George W. Good are at their home in this village after staying in New York since last November. They were present at the homecoming celebration for Theodore Roosevelt. A month after the end of Roosevelt's presidency in March 1909, he went on an African safari that lasted a year, that is, until March 1910. He then toured Western Europe before returning to New York City on June 18th, 1910, and this was probably the homecoming celebration that the Goods attended. Mrs. Leonard W. Wheeler entertained the Thimble Club at Paradise Spring Tuesday. A picnic dinner was served at noon. There was a full attendance with the exception of Mrs. J. Herbert Fletcher and Miss Ruth Fisher, who were unable to be present. The Wheelers lived at 66 Main Street, and Paradise was that area behind their house on the brow of Tadmech Hill facing to the north. It was a very beautiful area known for its wildflowers and ferns. Miss Grace Lumbard went this week to Cohasset on the South Shore, where she is to be located for the summer in a children's hospital. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Howard of Concord, New Hampshire, with their little son John, have been spending a week with his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Calvin Howard, on Howard Road. Miss Ruth Fisher has been enjoying vacation days at Plymouth. Miss Clara Fisher, who has been detained from her work in the law library at the courthouse Lowell on account of illness, is able to resume daily trips again. Miss Marjorie Seavey has been visiting since the close of school with Mrs. E.J. Meacham at her pleasant home in Holyoke. Mrs. Meacham was formerly Miss Millie Smith, a popular teacher at the old primary school. There is a particularly interesting set of pictures from the Library Art Club on exhibit at the library dealing with Concord. They portray in some degree the wealth of historic and literary association in which this beautiful old town abounds. For the first time in many weeks, our village nurse, Miss Mary Moran, has been having a little time at her home at the center. The next section is called Children's Sunday. That Sunday set aside in early summer as exclusively belonging to the children was observed most successfully at the Congregational Church last Sunday morning. The large audience present readily extended the responsive appreciation that the exercises merited. The decorations were especially pretty, being a skillful arrangement of lilies, mountain laurel, syringas, and ferns, and making an attractive setting for the bright faces of the children. The beautiful and impressive rites of baptism were received by 4 little ones: Roger Haywood Hildreth, son of Mr. and Mrs. Charles L. Hildreth, Violet Marion Green, and Evelyn Marjorie Green, daughters of Mr. and Mrs. William E. Green, and John Henry Perkins, son of Mr. and Mrs. John Perkins. There is a long paragraph giving the program that I will omit. Mrs. David Wallace, Mrs. Mary May Atwood, Grace Lumbard, and Edith Wright were the committee in charge. The next section is the Forge Village section. Andrew and Michael Walsh of Lawrence were guests Sunday of Mr. and Mrs. William Venn. Bernard McCann of Lowell returned home Sunday after spending a very enjoyable week as the guest of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Finn. Miss Mary Gardner is spending this week with Mrs. Bessie O'Neill of Schaefer Street, Lowell. Miss Catherine May has returned from Long Island, New York, where she went to attend the marriage of her sister, Miss Cecilia May, on Wednesday, June 15th. Miss Mary C. Joyce and Miss Alice Joyce of 12th Street, Lowell, were entertained Sunday at the home of Miss Christina Lowther. The Forge Village Lions were favored with good weather Saturday to play their expected game with the Pawtucket Blues, but they failed to show up. Next Saturday, the Lions will cross bats with the Richmonds on the home grounds. A very enjoyable dance was held in Abbott Hall Saturday evening under the direction of the RTS. I believe that stands for Religious Tract Society, composed of well-known young men of the town. Reverend Mr. Beals of Beechmont occupied the pulpit at St. Andrew's Mission last Sunday. There will be no more Sunday school until September. John Young and James Gallagher of Newark, New Jersey, returned home Sunday after a very enjoyable visit spent as guests of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Smith and family on Lakeside Avenue. They were among the large number of Keighley, England people who attended the reception given by Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Finn to a number of their countrymen who recently arrived here. Tuesday evening, Mr. and Mrs. William Venn entertained the same party at their home on Bradford Street. The time was pleasantly spent in renewing old acquaintances. Solos were rendered by Miss Sadie Smith, Miss Mary Gardner, John Young, and James Gallagher. Selections were given by Bernard McCann on the flute and several other instruments. Mr. McCann is an accomplished musician. A duet by James Burns and Patrick Brophy concluded the musical program, and refreshments were served. Mrs. Eva F. Pine, Pyne, and Miss Letitia V. Ward are enjoying a vacation from their school duties at Warren, New Hampshire, with relatives of Miss Pine. Miss Abby M. Blaisdell of Wamisit spent Sunday at the home of Mr. and Mrs. James Wilson. The infant son of Mr. and Mrs. William Blodgett of the Ridges was christened George R., and the infant daughter of Mr. and Mrs. James Wiggum was named Doris Ada on Sunday by Reverend Mr. Beals at St. Andrew's Mission. The English Tea Party, which was to have been held in Recreation Hall Saturday evening, has been postponed to a future date. The affair was in charge of the Ladies' Sewing Circle. The next section is called Burglary. Burglars broke into the office of Abbott & Company's worsted mills sometime between midnight Friday and early Saturday morning. Entrance was effected by breaking in the door. The safe was blown to pieces, but only $100 obtained. All the costs and carpets in the office were used to deaden the sound, and although the safe was completely wrecked, not a window was broken. It is believed that the people who did the work came in an automobile, as the tracks lead up to the door of the office, and was heard to pass through the village between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m. Victor Pigeon, who recently opened a meat market, was aroused at 1:30 o'clock Saturday morning by a knock at the door. Getting up, he saw 4 men in the street, and he asked them what they wanted, and one of them said they were walking to Harvard and was hungry. They seemed to be all right, so he came downstairs and let 2 of them in. One was of light complexion with light mustache, while the other was of smooth face and wore a navy blue suit. He sold them 5 pounds of pig's feet, and then they inquired the way to Harvard. When told, they turned and went in the opposite direction. The men wore good clothing and did not look like tramps. Samuel Blowy, who was employed as watchman at the suspender factory in Littleton and works from 12 at noon till midnight, arrived home on his bicycle at 12:45 a.m. Saturday and saw a team standing at the post office, which is a short distance from the office of Abbott & Company. The light, which always burns at night in the post office, showed that the team was empty. Many believe that the men that visited Victor Pigeon's store came in the team and were for a good time. That's the news in Westford for the week ending June 25th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.